Hello, my friends. Thank you to be back here on Smart City TV for this interview with Faris Oweis. Faris is the CEO of Instigation Protocol, a company that has been working to help other companies to deploy blockchain solutions. And Faris has also good and long-time experience on implementing solutions for smart cities. So I welcome you here, Faris. I ask the friends joining today as Smart City TV to subscribe to the channel, like it, like the interview, like Faris, and welcome, Faris. Nice to have you here. Please talk a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, well, hopefully we get likes, and hopefully I'm a likable guy. We'll see. But basically, at Instigation Protocol, it was born out of my experience in smart cities. So I found it very difficult for organizations to create change that had economic impact and reduce social inequality in cities by working directly with cities. It was a bit of a maze and a bit of a challenge. And through my journey, I got very interested in blockchain specifically, not from necessarily a technical aspect, but the values that it can facilitate, how it can distribute value, how it can provide people to own their own data and provide consent and create all sorts of interesting business models with that. So what we decided to do is focus on working with blockchain organizations and helping them tell compelling stories and commercialize specifically with enterprise and government to in turn change the business models and policies within those respective organizational types. And we've been doing that in some cases cities, and like I would call it themes that cities cover, like mobility, energy, governance, things like that, but also wider industry applications, everything from music streaming to telecoms to aviation. So it's been an interesting journey in that respect.
Good. And so tell me how blockchain can help to make a city smarter.
Yeah, I'll answer the question by giving you a personal example and a personal experience just the other day. I voted the other day. And we have this thing, and I'm in Austin, Texas, and we have Proposition A, which is essentially to sign off on a boatload of money to put a public transport system in with our tax dollars, primarily property tax. I voted against. I voted against because I didn't trust. I trusted that my tax dollars would go to somebody, but I didn't trust my dollars would be spent in a way that would create the outcome of which was being presented to me, which is all these like light rail lines and bus systems and things like that. So at the core of it, without getting on a like application layer of like, okay, it could be good for voting, it could be for this, it could be good for that, on just a basic like human level, it creates it facilitates trust and accountability, which citizens feel disconnected from as it relates to the relationship with government. And that could be something in my example that I mentioned in terms of a capital project. And it could be something very simple from, and different cities have different problems. So like in emerging countries, like school attendance is a big problem, or in Africa, land rights are a big problem. So it can be very small, but very big, but it all boils down to trust and accountability and the transparency around that between all the stakeholders involved in real time. And I think that's the power. And then I think that's why you see a lot of different governments are, you know, obviously different from region to region, but are, I guess, transferring from what they call Web 2, which is what we're currently experiencing, our internet today, to Web 3, that's built on this technology that facilitates the values of which I just shared.
Okay, so listen, in Brazil, there is something called the participatory budget. Some cities have adopted, where the citizens vote where they want the money to be expended. But on the other hand, you never know if the money was really expended on that specific proposition. So do you believe that the use of blockchain can help to control and facilitate the citizens to put their money on that specific proposition the city wants to do?
Yeah, so it's called track and trace in the blockchain world. So basically it's tracking, and this is what people are talking about right now with COVID, like tracking a vaccine from its origin to a human, right? And all the different people that, you know, are in between, whether it be, you know, UPS, the pharmaceutical, the plane, you know, all that, the temperature on the plane and all that. So in this case, it's a track and trace where, you know, if every single form of currency that is put forth and the vote is tied to your identity, and that's another key part of blockchain. So identity is the core of it, right? You have an identity. The difference between the identity solutions that we have today and the identity solutions that people in this world, this blockchain movement, are trying to bring forward, is the core difference is centralized versus decentralized. So centralized means that your identity is owned and stored on servers of one organization. That could be a government or that could be IBM, right? But it's centralized. The power of decentralization is that your identity, a couple things happen. By virtue of not being stored in one place, it's safer because your identity is spread across what they call nodes, which are computers all around the world, through a network of computers versus having one choke point of failure in one kind of server with one company. And when you do that, you create all forms of capabilities that individuals have with their data. So for example, you're able to provide rich consent. So my data, this type of data can be used in this way, but this data can't. My vote can be tied to my identity, or it can't. You have a choice, you have agency. So in your example, the vote would be placed on how to spend, let's say, on a rapid bus line, BRT, right? And millions of people do it, and the money goes, and then the money, I don't know the exact process would it be, but like the government takes it, they'll go to the bus company, they buy the buses, then they hire the drivers, and then you can track the money of how it's being spent from literally start to finish, from all that stuff happening to the roads being laid out, to the bus stands being put up, to you getting on that bus. And if there's any kind of lack of transparency, it would show as a result of being able to track and trace it from origin to endpoint.
So that means that the auditing process becomes much more transparent and easy to follow.
Much more transparent, easy to follow, for sure. And this is why a lot of major corporations are switching to blockchain. Two ways. Well, I should put a caveat on that. They're doing this, yeah, to create transparency, but it's also to reduce costs, which in turn means they can fire people that are doing this manually today. This is why banks are adopting it, to get rid of an entire back office, because they can now do this through blockchain.
Okay, good. So listen, another point that I would like to address with you, it's some authors are identifying that cities are becoming much more states, nation states. Singapore is a good example, Qatar and Doha is another one, Dubai. So these big cities are becoming smarter, much more integrated, and in some cases they are having the possibility to create their own blockchain or their own cryptocurrency infrastructure, their electronic wallet, and things like that.
Yeah.
What is your opinion? Do you think that is a trend? Some other big cities, even if they are not self-contained like Singapore and Dubai, they will go into this direction to become kind of independent of a federal identity?
Yeah, so I think we're moving from the nation state being on a national level to that type of philosophy being experienced on a city level. So right now, cities typically are dealing with problems that aren't adequately addressed, let's say on a state or federal level, and they're trying to deal with these problems once they reach the ground with much more limited budget than their federal counterparts, right? As more people congregate in these cities and regions, we begin to create our own ecosystems that are self-reliant. And then in turn, a lot of those dependencies that we have on a federal level now need to be managed and exchanged on a local level. And that's where, blockchain comes in handy, in the sense that the more stakeholders you have involved, the more key identity, the more key transparency is, and the more key accountability becomes for issues, frankly, that cities aren't accustomed to handling on a standalone basis. And it's particularly important with limited budget, because there's all sorts of efficiencies, not just from a transparency standpoint, but literally from a process standpoint. Okay.
And do you have any examples? Can you nominate some cities that are moving in that direction?
Yeah. There's a lot. So basically, the region I would say that's leading this is, by hands down, without a doubt, Asia. US is like, it's a mess in terms of getting legislation, creating a regulatory environment that makes it easy for people to innovate. So, and there's a difference, like in terms of like blockchain and cryptocurrency. They've evolved a little bit in terms of cryptocurrency, but not as much as blockchain. Whereas in China, maybe I won't use China as an example because they're using it for their own, maybe there's more political angle there, but I'll give Korea as an example. So Korea, blockchain is actually, it's at the very top. And the way I say it's at the very top is because it's actually deemed as an investment that's tied to national security. So literally, when they're having national security conversations, it's literally in legislation that blockchain is part of ensuring national security. So when you have that kind of top-down commitment, that then trickles down to organizations. So like a Samsung is getting involved because they're building infrastructure around a very clear, cohesive, and concise national strategy that they can then depend on to commercialize within. And then that trickles down to cities, whereas like, for example, Seoul, I believe the mayor actually passed away, if I'm not mistaken, a few months ago, but you know, he basically created an ecosystem that welcomed massive amounts of blockchain investment, blockchain in parks, co-working spaces, startup cash for different companies, all to kind of build towards this environment of shifting from Web 2 to Web 3 to basically embrace the advantages and the benefits that blockchain will bring, not necessarily in the present, because it goes along a curve, right? There's some initial investment, new way of doing things, change management, but eventually committed to a future. And that's where Asia comes in handy in this sense where, like, for example, just yesterday, China got together amidst this pandemic to put their 5-year plan together. They think in 5, 10, 100 years. So they don't see it as like a 24-hour news cycle like we do in the US, where in the US, when the pandemic hit, we still have cities that and states where their infrastructure is built on code from the 50s, right? So it's all about basically political will, risk, and intent. And it seems that Asia, particularly in my example, Korea, has it, and then the US, by contrast, doesn't. But a lot what I hear from US cities and stakeholders within that is that there's a lack of education. This is what I hear. And the problem with that is that there's plenty of information and there's companies that have it, but at the same time, companies will always sell what people are willing to buy. So if a buyer is not educated on what's available, there's no incentive for the people selling it to sell it, right? And that doesn't exist as much as prominently in other countries, which maybe are less, capitalist driven, where there is investment in education, where there is investment to have national and then private sector strategies, and then have a whole, small, medium enterprise ecosystem that thrives on that and makes it affordable to engage, and then startups that can build to then service that ecosystem with new forms of value. So that's how these innovation ecosystems are sprouting up, largely in Asia, but also sporadically, obviously, in the US as well.
Okay, so let's move a little bit aside of the main conversation and go a little bit on the area of risk and security. So we are transitioning from a paper-based economy to a paperless based economy, where everything will rely on computers, on information, on data. What are the risks to that transition? So what will be the weakest point on the chain that can fail and provide us and bring us a collapse on the economy if something really bad happens?
Well, yeah, I mean, digitalization has existed forever, right? Like, people like to talk about cryptocurrencies, but PayPal is digital, right? Across Asia, they use WeChat. It's digital, right? It's been touchless payment forever. So, there are risks associated with that, but they're, I guess, minuscule in terms of like the alternative. So blockchain is not I wouldn't say it's it's not the solution for everything, right? Sometimes you can have digital solutions that can be backed up by just a simple database, right? But anytime there's multiple stakeholders involved and you need to track the provenance of that data, number one, and two, maybe you need to optimize or reduce the costs associated with transacting based on that data exchange. And then three, and this is a major one for me personally in the work that I do, is essentially eliminating intermediaries as a result from getting the value that you want to receive and the people giving you the value. So that could be as simple as like, me wanting to grab an Uber, but not really wanting my data to be owned by Uber and my money to transfer from Uber to the driver, and then for Uber to take basically a toll fee on the money I want to give the driver, right? The only thing separating me and the driver is trust, right? So what do? We outsource the trust to Uber. So in this kind of movement, this kind of shift from Web 2 to Web 3, we're basically saying that we don't need Uber. This is really what it boils down to. So the reason a lot of these enterprise, and a lot of people are making the case, we won't need government. A lot of people are talking about digital mayors, for example. Yeah. We all complain. I think this is pretty much a universal feeling that we all complain that our government's slow. There's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, and a lot of it could be, if it was a private sector company that was publicly listed, a lot of those departments would be fired and it would be optimized and it would kind of return shareholder value, but it has a different purpose. So in this case, it's those three things. It's provenance, which is again the the source of the data moving to the endpoint, right? And all the checkpoints that were in between and the stakeholders that engaged, the transaction, if one's required, between the value that's being given and the value that's trying to be received. Because right now we pay Visa and all these people, 3.5. We talk a lot about saving our local businesses here in the pandemic, but if you go to your local, Mexican restaurant down the street and everyone used a credit card there and they did $1 million in revenue, let's say last year, 200,000 of that is just gone just by everyone using a credit card. And now they're starving for 10 grand here, 5 grand here, right? So all these things are in the spirit of eliminating these, this friction between value exchange. But again, not all of it has to be on blockchain. Some of it, particularly when it involves multiple stakeholders that all have to contribute input or value at different stages of the life cycle of that data, that's where blockchain becomes quite powerful, quite optimal, and quite useful.
Yeah, for sure. But listen, we normally talk about blockchains. There is almost an immediate association to blockchains to cryptocurrency. However, blockchains may provide additional areas to support mainly on trusted transactions. So what other areas do you see we can use blockchains in a city other than cryptocurrencies?
Oh, I don't have to even hypothesize about it. It's already happening, right? So mobility, for example. So all these companies are, obviously investing billions and, literally billions into autonomous vehicles. Now, those vehicles need to be associated with a person. That person needs an identity. That car is going to be a data machine. The cars of the future will be data machines. And that data will be worth, just like our data right now, let's say on Facebook, is worth a lot to third parties. I think the average is like $200 a month. That data from our car is going to be worth a lot to all sorts of different stakeholders, right? Telecom companies, based on the data we produce in the car, the data between cars, the data between cars and infrastructure, for example. So there's a lot of these mobility companies that are building this infrastructure on blockchain specifically to facilitate value exchange between external data point, let's say a toll, the car itself, and the human being that actually owns the car. So when that car is producing value, the human being who has a secure and verifiable identity within it can receive the value that car produces, right? So that's like an immediate mobility example, right? I'll give you some more in telecoms, right? So we're working on a project now in partnership with GSMA, where basically we're proving out with these telecoms. So mobile subscribers, basically, like most companies, they give you like a 60-page terms and conditions, and in it, basically, you give up your rights, is essentially what it boils down to. They take your location data, they take your all sorts of data, what apps you're using, what apps you're not using, like literally a laundry list. So the value proposition there is that instead of burying that in the T's and C's, just provide people rich consent, say, hey, I'm willing to share for example, my location data with you. And then when that is sold, which is usually to one of two people, either a brand directly or to a Nielsen, which packages the data and structures it in a way that people can then create insights off of. If that's worth money, that returns to the actual subscriber, right? So the whole premise behind this application of blockchain in the telecom space and many others is, again, providing subscribers consent and agency, and then making sure that they monetize on the value that they produce today. But the only difference is that it doesn't all be owned by the company that sells it off to the third party. It's shared with the actual human being that produces it. So that's another example. I'll give you a pandemic specific one as well. So obviously so some countries are more dependent on tourism than others. As an example, like Maldives is more dependent on tourism, let's say the US is, as an example. So a lot of these airport authorities and usually two ministries, foreign affairs and the equivalent of it in each country in tourism, but also cities, particularly major hubs that are dependent on tourism, basically need a safe and secure way to collect a passport form of identity, verify that is the human being, verify that they have the proper documentation in compliance with those government rules. So that, for example, that could be your passport ID, that could be also backed up by a second ID, let's say a driver's license. Also your flight information, which has to comply with your staying X amount of days, a hotel booking, you have 14 days at least of quarantine, like all these things. And then your COVID test that has to come back negative, but it has to be submitted within 24 hours of the test being taken from a specific accredited lab that they've identified specific to that country. So it's a lot of specificity, right? A lot. So they're seeing blockchain and specifically the decentralized identity that can be built on top of it as a core value proposition for heightened security. And then for the passenger, now ultimately what it's about, to feel trust and security with that data and that it's being shared in only ways that it has to. So I'll give you a more granular example that when a government receives this test, they don't actually have to look at the test, right? It's called an attestation. So they just have to know that it's been approved as negative by an accredited source on the blockchain, and it's immutable, which means it can't be changed, and it was received in X amount of time because it was timestamped, which also can't be changed on the blockchain, and then it's approved. They don't need to know my name is Faris, and then I got the test at this place. They just know the place is accredited and that I was negative, right? So that's the equivalent of me not having to prove I'm over 21 years old by showing my ID and all my information. It's just that I can provide an attestation that they can then validate from an external third party, i.e. the DMV, that I'm over 21 and I got the beard to prove it.
Yeah, that's interesting. However, I think this will require that the infrastructure supporting those kind of technology needs to spread out much more than is available today. Yeah, and it's a huge investment in infrastructure or digital infrastructure to support it.
Yeah, it's kind of like browser wars right now. If you remember browser wars back in the day, and obviously today we have, Google emerged from all that. But, there's like blockchain is like the term, but there's many organizations that are vying for their infrastructure to be the one. So for example, Hyperledger, which is largely powered by IBM from a development resource standpoint, they're working a lot with central banks and governments. Ripple on their blockchain. They feel because all these blockchains try to separate themselves in essentially the same ways. Their governance model, transactions per second, scalability. So they all battle each other based on these like areas of value, and then they pitch that to governments and enterprise. So there's a lot of these different companies, well-funded, that are vying to get their infrastructure to be the groundwork for this Web3 architecture that these enterprises and governments need. And now different governments are choosing different services. They're finding new ways to collaborate. For example, in the mobility space that I gave the example of, BMW, Daimler, all them, they work with multiple blockchain organizations, not just one. So there's a competition. So there's no one blockchain, right? There's multiple commercial enterprises built on blockchain that are vying to be the infrastructure of the future / present.
And what about the interoperability issues between those multiple companies with multiple technologies?
Yeah, so a lot of the time, blockchain companies are coming to these organizations. I'll stick with the tourism example. Like, how, like, for example, in cities, like there's this open data challenge, there's all these different standards. So like Barcelona's open data is different than, let's say, Melbourne's, for example, right? So there's no interoperability between the data. So then you have companies that are saying, wow, we can help with that and establish interoperability, because the service itself, the technology provided, isn't meant to be interoperable. It's meant to, hey, it's like if you were in the defense industry, it's like Lockheed doesn't want to work with Raytheon. It's like, no, we want to get the big contract for all the jets, right? There's like no incentive. So with blockchain organizations, because a lot of the time they're not making money by you paying for it. A lot of the time they're making money for the network being used, right? So they have a commercial incentive, let's call it, to then create interoperability between all these systems, whether it be on a local government of any size between departments, or whether it be with, in the tourism example, there's over, I think, 80 biometric services that are used across airports around the world, which makes it very, not frictionless. It makes it very hard to create a seamless traveler journey and maintain security and privacy along the way.
Yeah.
So a lot of these blockchain organizations are actually positioning themselves, I would say, as a form of creating interoperability between these different commercially hungry enterprises that have already laid down previous groundwork.
Okay, well, since our channel is dedicated to smart city information and news and technology about it, so we know that there are many mayors around the world, many cities in the world, they are moving into making their proposition, making their plans to become smarter, to move into the smart city direction. So what will be your recommendation to those cities, to those mayors, how they have to consider, how they shall consider this transition to blockchain technology, where they shall focus, where they shall plan.
Yeah, I think it's actually a good value proposition for them because it gets them out of a hole, and I'll explain. So right now, the AI person's coming at you. You need AI. Okay, great. Let's get the AI over here, but the AI is not over there. How do we get the AI over there? Shoot, what am I gonna do? Let's get another AI thing here. Hey, you need machine learning. Well, we already got the AI, but it's different. Okay, here's the machine learning, right? And then to your point earlier, nation state to city state, just a ton more services are going to be provided and much more interdependency on different systems, right? From mobility to energy to, you name it. So what blockchain does is it creates a nice foundation for a security layer and a transparency layer for all these technologies to cooperate with one another. It's actually not the penthouse, it's the foundation, where AI and all these other ones are tools that take you in different directions, but when left to their own vices can kind of get away from you. A lot of the time, and a big complaint with cities is that they get things in isolation. It's fragmented. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. One department procures a solution for, say, for homelessness, and another department gets a solution for homelessness from two different companies, right? Again, no one's speaking. So blockchain creates a nice foundation for this data to speak to one another harmoniously, while at the same time create transparency and accountability between not just government, but the private sector stakeholders that participate in the value that gets created as a result. So I would say that, and my example with Korea and China is a huge example, and a lot of different Asian countries, there's a little more incentive than there are in developed countries, because there's a lot more low income people that are gravitating towards middle class that have new digital needs that they didn't previously have, versus US, where our problem is we have a lot of stuff. Our problem is that we don't get it to poor people enough. So we have a distribution problem. So it's a tool to create a foundation and then create more equitable distribution of that value to all citizens, not just the ones that can pay for it in regions that have high property taxes or whatnot. So it creates a great foundation in that respect. Good.
Faris, listen, time flies by, so we have a limited time for the interview. This conversations can go for hours and hours. Is a challenging topic, a very interesting one. So I thank you very much for your time and appreciate your being available to us to talk about this exciting technology. Please, your final words for the channel and our viewers.
Yeah, I've always, my journey in blockchain started in the smart city space. And the reason I do what I do is because I feel it can be very meaningful. And because I remember when pre-COVID, when we used to all go to Barcelona, right, for the Smart City World Congress.
Yes.
We look at Barcelona, we look at Amsterdam, we look at some of these countries, and when you look at them, the ones that you revere versus the ones like, oh, I wish it would be this way. I think more often than not, you'll find that the ones that you revere use blockchain or use the principles of blockchain to create a smart city and connect community in meaningful ways. I would just kind of encourage the viewership to dig deeper on the cities that they kind of view as smart, in the sense that they create great community. And I think somewhere in that journey, you'll find that they're using blockchain as a tool to facilitate that type of community and that type of value, where maybe the ones that you don't see as smart, you see as a lot of technology, but disconnected and not interoperable, and maybe not building on technology such as blockchain, which harbors the values that you're looking for within your city.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much again to our viewers. I appreciate attending this interview. Please subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and see you the next time. Thank you, Faris. See you next. Bye.